Imagine walking across an open field, the sky calm, the ground beneath your feet seemingly solid, but with every step, everything could vanish. A blast, smoke, fragments of life torn apart. This is how Ukraine transformed vast stretches of land into invisible zones of death. Not with tanks, not with missiles, but with silence, with fear, with landmines. Landmines don't make noise, they don't shout, they don't chase, but they are always there, waiting. And when they are triggered, they don't just wound bodies, they shatter entire strategies. Small weapons, cheap, but ruthlessly effective. In the war between Ukraine and Russia, they became the deadliest element on the modern battlefield. While the eyes of the world fixated on drones, cinematic explosions, and troop movements, the real game was being played in silence, beneath the soil. That's where Ukraine rewrote the rules of war. One wrong step, a metallic click, a sudden end. This video is about that. About how Ukraine built a deadly labyrinth beneath the feet of its enemy. How it turned the earth itself into a weapon. But not just that. It's about fear, about uncertainty, about intelligence that devours brute strength. And how, on this mine-laced battlefield of strategy and emotion, survival doesn't belong to the strongest, but to the most aware. Stay until the end, because the final revelation will change the way you see modern warfare. There was a time when armored columns were the pride of military doctrine. Rows of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and supply trucks cutting through terrain with an aura of unstoppable force. Their presence alone was enough to break resistance. Steel became the symbol of security, of power, of dominance. But in Ukraine, that narrative collapsed. The very strength of those armored beasts became their greatest weakness. Drones, once tools for reconnaissance, evolved into precision weapons. They hovered quietly above, eyes unblinking, waiting for targets. Artillery adapted. Algorithms calculated trajectories. Heat signatures glowed in monitors like curses waiting to be spoken. The battlefield had changed. Not in appearance, but in logic. Armor was no longer protection. It was a beacon. So the Russian military pivoted. They abandoned the old rhythm of war, the heavy, thunderous marches, and embraced a new, desperate dance. Mobility over armor, speed over defense. And at the heart of this shift, motorcycles. At first glance, it made sense. 2 wheels instead of 20 tons. Nimble. Quick. Able to dart across fields, weave between debris, disappear into forests. The low profile of a motorcycle was less visible to drones, less vulnerable to artillery strikes. Troops riding these machines became ghosts on the battlefield, appearing and vanishing in moments, unreachable by conventional tactics. But this shift came at a cost. What was gained in agility was lost in protection. These soldiers were no longer encased in steel. A single bullet could kill. A sudden stop could be fatal. And while they could move faster, they had to choose every path carefully. Because every field, every trail, every stretch of open terrain could be the end. Still, in their desperation, Russian forces leaned into the gamble. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of motorcycles were dispatched across strategic regions. Recon, supply runs, flanking maneuvers, assaults. The roar of engines replaced the rumble of treads. It was a different kind of war, a lighter war, one that hoped to outsmart the Ukrainian grip with sheer velocity. But Ukraine was watching. They saw the shift, and they understood its logic. What came next wasn't a reaction, it was a preparation. Because Ukraine wasn't just playing defense anymore. They weren't just resisting, they were setting a trap. When your enemy changes form, you don't chase him, you study him. You let him believe he's found an opening. You watch his patterns, where he moves, where he hesitates, where he thinks he's safe. And then, without warning, you turn his path into a grave. That's exactly what Ukraine did. The shift in Russian tactics didn't go unnoticed. Ukrainian engineers, tacticians, and intelligence officers gathered every shred of data they could. Satellite imagery, drone footage, intercepted communications. They saw the patterns forming. Motorcycles were moving through open terrain, avoiding main roads, skirting forests, using speed as armor. And from that, a new strategy was born. Not to stop the Russians in their tracks, but to let them keep moving, right into death. The Ukrainian response was quiet, calculated, cold. They began laying mines not just randomly, but surgically. Not in dense clusters, but in corridors that looked safe. Corridors where motorcycle units would likely pass. Where tracks were already visible. Where previous movement suggested future movement. Where the terrain whispered, "This way." These weren't just minefields. They were maps. Invisible maps. The ground itself became the storyteller. A place that remembered where the Russians had passed and where they would return. The soil, once neutral, became treacherous. Not through chaos, but through design. Ukrainian sappers began constructing layered traps. A narrow lane of clear terrain flanked by 2 strips of mines. The middle seemed untouched, like an invitation. But further down the lane, an isolated cluster of anti-personnel mines, just enough to cause hesitation. That hesitation would push riders left or right into anti-vehicle charges. The explosion wouldn't just stop the bike, it would maim or kill instantly. And if the rider swerved again, drones above would mark the attempt and transmit coordinates to artillery units. But what made it cruelly brilliant was its silence. There were no fences, no warning signs, no visible threat, just the illusion of safety. That illusion became a weapon, more powerful than bullets, more haunting than bombs. Because once a single unit was lost in such a corridor, the rest of the Russian troops would begin to question every route, every trail, every open field. Trust began to erode, not just in their environment, but in their command. And that was the beginning of the real trap. Because when a soldier stops trusting the ground beneath him, he stops moving forward. And in war, hesitation is death. This wasn't World War II. And these weren't just random patches of explosives buried in haste. What Ukraine laid beneath the soil was far more advanced, more strategic, more intelligent. These were smart minefields, born not only of engineering, but of surveillance, of electronic warfare, of patience. Every explosive was placed with purpose. Every inch of mined land was mapped, monitored, and, most importantly, connected to a broader web of battlefield intelligence. Imagine a chessboard where every square could kill you. Now imagine your opponent sees the board from above, while you stumble across it, blindfolded. That's how Ukraine turned the battlefield into a machine. Drones hovered above the terrain like silent sentinels. FPVs, thermal sensors, high-resolution optics. They didn't just observe, they guided. Not only did they track Russian movement, they predicted it. They watched how bikers swerved to avoid debris, how units flanked left instead of right, how they chose speed over caution. And every choice was noted, recorded, and added to the algorithm of death. But drones weren't the only eyes. Electronic warfare units jammed Russian communications, lured them into dead zones, or planted false signals. Entire columns were misled by phantom safe routes, paths that ended in meticulously planted mine belts. Anti-personnel mines to maim, anti-vehicle charges to obliterate. Some were even remotely triggered. Others were pressure-sensitive. But the deadliest were layered. Step 1, a small explosion. Step 2, panic. Step 3, a chain reaction. Ukrainian engineers understood the psychology of movement. They knew how fear altered paths, how panic created patterns, how a single misstep could set off a cascade of wrong decisions. So they didn't just lay mines, they laid decisions. They created minefields that guided behavior, funneling Russian units into pre-designed kill zones, where artillery, snipers, and drones waited like wolves in the fog. And once inside, there was no map out. Because the battlefield itself was now dynamic. It learned, it adapted, it punished hesitation as much as recklessness. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. But to Ukraine, it was symphony, a precise technological dance of terrain and intelligence. Because war has changed. And in this new era, the deadliest weapons don't roar. They wait. There are weapons that explode, and there are weapons that haunt. Landmines do both, but their greatest power isn't in the detonation. It's in the doubt, in the seconds before the boot touches the ground. In the moment the engine hums, and the rider wonders if this path is the last. In the silence, the stillness, the unknown, that's where the real war begins. Inside the mind, Ukraine understood this deeply. They knew that fear, once planted, spreads like wildfire. That a single explosion doesn't just kill, it echoes. It lingers in the thoughts of those who survive. It slows movement. It clouds decisions. It replaces confidence with suspicion. And so, even when no mines exploded, they were still doing their work. Russian units began to hesitate. Routes once used confidently were now approached with dread. Simple missions, supply drops, scouting runs took longer. Motorcyclists stopped to double-check terrain. Some refused to ride. Others chose longer, riskier paths through dense forest or rocky hills, hoping to avoid a hidden death. The land itself became a ghost. Every patch of soil could be a grave. Every step, a question. And that uncertainty was worse than pain. Because it turned every soldier inward. It dissolved unity. It replaced aggression with hesitation, planning with paranoia. A mine doesn't just kill the body, it erodes morale. Ukraine amplified this effect with precision. Sometimes they let a few bikes pass unharmed, then detonated on the last. Other times, they waited until soldiers returned, triggering mines on the same paths they once thought were safe. The message was clear. Nowhere is truly clear. You are never truly safe. It was slow, relentless. Psychological erosion. Some Russian commanders reportedly refused to send motorcycles through certain zones. Others rotated riders frequently, trying to reduce the emotional toll. Helmet cam footage and intercepted conversations revealed it all. The silence after a blast, the disbelief, the anxiety creeping into every order. This wasn't just warfare. It was psychological engineering. Because when the enemy doubts the ground they stand on, they doubt everything. And a soldier who doubts does not fight. He survives. And in survival, strategy dies. Above the fields of Ukraine, something invisible was orchestrating death. It didn't scream or roar. It hovered, observed, calculated. Drones, small, precise, persistent, had become more than tools of surveillance. They became extensions of strategy, of vision, of intent. Ukrainian forces no longer fought merely with soldiers and steel. They fought with foresight, with machines that could see beyond the hills, track movements through fog, and follow the heat signatures of Russian riders as if watching from the eyes of a god. But it wasn't just observation. It was orchestration. FPV drones, first-person view, equipped with real-time cameras and operated by skilled pilots, roamed the skies like predatory birds. They flew low, fast, intimate with the terrain. Their job wasn't simply to gather information, it was to guide death, to time it, to sharpen it. Imagine a Russian soldier riding a motorcycle across an open field, the wind in his ears, the engine vibrating beneath him. Ahead, the trail seems clear. He sees no threat, but above him, unseen, a drone is watching, silently communicating with the minefields below, transmitting his exact location, his speed, his trajectory. And then, nothing. No warning. Just a blast beneath his wheels. This is how the drones worked, not alone, but in concert with the mines. They were the eyes, the minds, the jaws. Together, they formed a system. A layered, lethal intelligence that left no room for luck. Some mines were remotely detonated by drone pilots. A rider passed a trigger point, and with a simple command, the earth erupted beneath him. Others were observed and marked, their locations confirmed by aerial reconnaissance before Ukrainian troops updated the kill zone data in real time. It was warfare at the edge of human-machine integration. But the drones also protected. They weren't only used to kill, but to guide Ukrainian units safely through their own labyrinth of traps. Routes were cleared, coordinates shared. Even civilian areas were surveyed with care. Mines disarmed with mechanical arms controlled from miles away. The same technology that brought destruction also saved lives. And then there were the psychological strikes. Sometimes drones followed Russian motorcycles at low altitude, just high enough to stay out of reach, just low enough to be seen. No attack, no explosion, just presence. A reminder that nothing is hidden, that even when you run, someone is watching. This silent stalking became unbearable for some. Reports of Russian troops shooting blindly into the sky, of riders abandoning vehicles mid-mission, of commands broken, units scattered, because when the sky becomes the enemy, there is no direction that feels safe. Not ahead, not behind, not above. This was no longer conventional war. This was something colder, more exact. Ukraine didn't need to match Russia in numbers. They needed to see more, react faster, strike without being struck. And with drones, they did exactly that. The battlefield was no longer flat. It had dimension. It had memory. It had eyes. At first, the numbers trickled in. One rider lost here. A vehicle shredded there. A small patrol vanished after entering what looked like a harmless valley. The reports were scattered. Inconclusive. Dismissed by some as random bad luck. But then, something shifted. The trickle became a flood. Helmet cam footage began to circulate, leaked by intercepted Russian devices, shared by Ukrainian intelligence, confirmed by drone feeds. Grainy, shaky videos that revealed more than any official report ever could. A soldier breathing heavily, dust in the air, the echo of an engine, and then, without drama, without warning, obliteration. The footage always ended the same way. Blackness. What the world saw wasn't just destruction, it was collapse. Chaos. Confusion spreading through ranks like fire through dry grass. Russian soldiers, already strained by long deployments and poor logistics, now faced a battlefield where even movement was a risk. Where stillness might mean survival, but motion could mean death. Entire units disappeared in minutes. One mine would trigger, and in that moment of shock, riders behind would accelerate. They'd swerve, they'd panic, and that panic fed into the trap. Because many of these minefields weren't designed to kill the first rider. They were designed to kill those who reacted. Chain detonations, engineered with brutal foresight, ripped through entire groups of motorcycles. One explosion set off two more. Vehicles thrown into the air like broken toys. Riders catapulted, screams, then silence. But the damage wasn't only physical. Intercepted Russian radio communications told another story. Voices trembling, commanders shouting over static, units calling for extraction that never came. Riders refusing to move without air support or drone sweeps. In some areas, motorcycles were abandoned altogether, left in the mud, unusable, symbolic of a tactic that had been turned against itself. And the fear, it was contagious. Fear slowed operations, delayed reinforcements, derailed offensives that had taken months to prepare. Russia began rerouting entire supply chains just to avoid certain zones. More drones were sent, not for attack, but just to check the ground. Paranoia spread like an infection. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was emotional defeat. Because when an army no longer trusts the routes it once depended on, when forward becomes synonymous with fatal, momentum dies. And in war, once momentum is lost, everything else begins to unravel. Ukraine never had to stop the entire Russian force. They just had to stop it from believing it could move. And with every lost rider, every scattered patrol, every shattered helmet, they did exactly that. Every generation thinks it understands war, until it's forced to fight a different kind. What happened in Ukraine wasn't just a defense tactic, it was an evolution. A shift so profound that it redefined what it means to control territory, to use terrain, to command fear. It didn't rely on overwhelming firepower or vast troop formations. It didn't depend on superior numbers or even superior technology in the conventional sense. It relied on intelligence, real-time, adaptive, integrated. It fused the old and the new, the archaic and the futuristic. Landmines, a weapon of centuries past, were reborn. Not as relics of outdated warfare, but as the nerve endings of a smart battlefield. Connected to drones, guided by data, activated with surgical timing. Ukraine didn't just plant mines, they planted questions. Where can I walk? Is this path safe? Who's watching me now? These weren't just battlefields anymore. They were psychological landscapes. And this evolution didn't stop at explosives. Ukraine integrated thermal imaging, real-time drone feeds, algorithmic route prediction, and electromagnetic warfare to sculpt the battlefield like a living organism. One that could sense, react, and adapt faster than the human mind could process. This wasn't mechanized war. It was cognitive war. A war in which decision-making speed was more valuable than armor. Where information mattered more than firepower. Where emotional control, within both commanders and frontline soldiers, became the most critical asset of survival. Russia, built on doctrines of mass assault and brute momentum, wasn't prepared for that shift. Its playbook was linear, predictable. It moved in force, assumed superiority through volume. But Ukraine didn't play on volume. They played on uncertainty. They didn't meet strength with strength. They turned strength into liability. They understood that every tank has a path, that every motorcycle needs terrain, and that every movement could be seen, not as an opportunity for victory, but as a vulnerability to exploit. They inverted the logic of battle itself. And the result? A battlefield where movement became a risk, where silence became strategy, where the enemy's own velocity became its undoing. This is what modern war looks like. Not grand invasions, but granular precision. Not overwhelming firestorms, but tiny detonations that fracture morale. It is slower, colder, more deliberate, and infinitely more psychological. Ukraine didn't just defend its territory, it redefined it. And in doing so, it changed what it means to fight. War, in its essence, is about territory, about who holds the ground, who commands the roads, who can move freely, and who cannot. But in Ukraine, something deeper emerged. The battlefield itself became the weapon. Not the soldiers, not the tanks, not the drones. The ground, the silence, the invisible. That was the true killer. That was the genius. Russian troops, thinking they had found a loophole, speed over armor, agility over force, were lured into a trap more ancient than warfare itself: hubris. The belief that cleverness alone could outmaneuver preparedness, that improvisation could overcome design. But in Ukraine, clever wasn't enough. Fast wasn't safe. And movement, once the key to survival, became the key to destruction. Ukraine didn't just resist. It rewrote. It rewrote how terrain is used, how fear is wielded, how machines in the sky can synchronize with bombs beneath the earth to craft a battlefield that thinks, that learns, that punishes arrogance in real time. They didn't match fire with fire. They turned the ground into fire. And that is more than military strategy. It is psychological art. The landscape itself told the story. Not through trenches or banners, but through absence. The absence of Russian momentum. The absence of trust. The absence of safety. Mines spoke in silence. Drones whispered death. And every time a soldier looked at the horizon, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a question. Is it safe to go on? That question, asked over and over, breaks something deeper than armor. It breaks the will to advance. It breaks the illusion of dominance. It breaks the soul of strategy. So when we look at what happened, when we see motorcycles burning in fields, drones circling above, the soil itself erupting, we are not just seeing destruction. We are witnessing transformation. This is the new battlefield. Not marked by borders, but by intelligence. Not guarded by gates, but by uncertainty. Not fought by armies, but by minds. And Ukraine turned its entire land into one. A mind, a trap, a lesson. One that echoes far beyond its borders. Because from now on, every army that marches, every general that plans, every soldier that moves, will wonder, is the ground beneath me truly mine? Or is it thinking too? If you've made it this far, thank you. And just above, there's a card showing the estimated financial losses Russia has suffered in this war. Click to learn more. I'll see you in the next video.